Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's episode of Dr. G's Think Tank on Resilience. What we're talking about this week is regulatory change. It turns out that 2025, and this won't be a surprise to a lot of people who are watching this, is the year of the regulatory shift. I would like to say that, that's it. Once we get to 2026, that will be over with, but that's unlikely to be true. Between state and federal regulatory changes just in 2025, this half of the year, Q3 and Q4, see somewhere between, depending on which organization's research you read, 40 and 60% of industries meaningfully impacted. What does that mean, meaningfully impacted? It means they have to think about shifting their market, their processes and procedures, their reporting, or even their products and services. What they offer has to change. That is, as you might imagine, incredibly stressful, really big changes. And that's why I wanted to talk about how do you find resilience in the face of that, when it changes fundamental things about how you do business, who you help, and the details of what you do all day. Joining me are two fantastic individuals. Let me introduce first Caitlin Gerslin. Caitlin is the Director of Internal Communications at Ascension. Ascension is one of the nation's leading nonprofit and Catholic health systems. Caitlin brings over 15 years of communication and change experience working with teams across community impact, operations, HR, finance, IT, and sales. She joined Ascension in 2024 and leads high-impact communication initiatives, including major workforce initiatives for HR and critical efforts within community impact and shared services. Before that, she spent almost a decade and a half at National Instruments, first in internal communications, and then as, and I love this title, Enterprise Change Leader. I was lucky enough to meet her when I spoke to a leadership group in which Caitlin is engaged, and she spoke eloquently about the regulatory challenges facing healthcare these days. Caitlin, hi, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So here's my first question for you. What are the biggest impacts you see in your work caused by regulatory changes this year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we think about all the regulatory changes, some of it is just like any change, right? There's uncertainty and questions that come about, regardless of where the change is. Now, with regulatory change, I think with some of the things I work on in particular in the healthcare space is really around the access that people have, especially if they are uninsured or on Medicaid. And so with some of those changes, some of it can be immediately felt, but a lot of the things that we're looking for is how do we plan ahead? So we know that change is on the horizon, but how do we kind of get ahead of what that might be when people may or may not be feeling the impact today? And something that you talked about in the intro that I've really come to ground that was delightful and surprising, I would say, is the moment to really root in who we are as an organization. So Ascension is really called to bring health, healing, and hope to all. And so in the face of all these regulatory changes, that is going unchanged. And so as we're thinking about the impact that we're seeing, it is equally, yes, let's be prepared. And also let's continue to stay rooted in who we are as an organization.
Okay, so you're saying so much uncertainty, and one of the strategies you're already jumping into is what doesn't change.
Yep.
There's so many unknown unknowns. So what's known? What's not going to shift? And I really appreciate that as a focus. I also hear you talking about how it isn't just that there are changes, it's that feeling of impending doom, right? That sense of like, we know for sure there are changes coming. Can we predict them? Should we try to predict them? What do we do? Okay, let's talk about another industry with a lot of change. Let me introduce, please, Peter Londa. Pete is a seasoned smart grid tech executive with over 20 years of experience in leadership roles. He joined Tantalus as president and chief executive officer in 2014. Before that, Pete served as the independent chair of the board of directors of World Energy Solutions and was actively involved in leading World Energy's sale to Enernoc. Previously, Pete served as the CEO of BPL Global, which was a leading smart grid company delivering tech solutions to the electric utility industry across the US, Europe, Middle East, India, and China. a veritable cornucopia of regulatory differences, I have to imagine. Pete's a graduate of Emory and has a JD and an MBA in finance and corporate law and a BA in economics. I was lucky enough to meet Pete in the before times, pre-pandemic. And we have really worked together on a bunch of different projects for a while. I have seen firsthand the mission-driven, intense, and necessary work that you lead at Tantalus, Pete. You really help communities all over the world get and keep power. And it's hard to imagine the scope of the impact that has. And I'm really grateful you joined me today. Hi, Pete.
Hi, Dr. G. Thank you.
So will you tell us, please, what are the biggest impacts you've seen in your work caused by regulatory changes this year?
I'd say what hasn't been impacted as things evolved earlier this year and a big change in Washington, D.C. To provide some context, particularly as it relates to the United States, we'll focus there. Going international creates a multitude of complexity, but within the U.S., most of us don't think about power until we don't have it, or until we get a bill that is really expensive. Okay. And so, when you think about the context of regulatory change and the impact it has on a business like Tantalus, which is solely focused on helping electric utilities be more efficient and reliable, so that all of us can be on this call today with power. It starts at the federal level, and then it drills down to the state level. And what we see consistently, or what we've seen here in 2025, is not only a fundamental shift in federal policy, and I'd say a mentality towards the power industry and generation. We've also seen that cascade down at a state-by-state level. And there is not a unified policy. There is not a unified set of regulatory structure or schemes that are applicable from the East Coast to the West Coast. And what happens in California is very different than what happens in Kentucky and Tennessee. And that's different than what's coming out of Washington, D.C. So as we think about this calendar year in particular, and the changing landscape that's unfolded, I'd say for us at Tantalus, the impact we've seen is how we ultimately prioritize our strategic decisions, how we try to stay as agile as possible as a smaller company, how we try to anticipate the impact that politicians may have on the way dollars are allocated within the utility industry. And then most importantly, and at its core, regardless of what those changes are, how do we make sure we're helping people keep lights on to help communities, whether that's just from an economic development perspective in normal course, or in the face of some really extreme weather events that continue to unfold even as we speak today.
Right. Do you have power utilities you serve in Jamaica?
We do not, but okay. We do cover the Caribbean basin, and we're aware of some of the utilities that are on standby to send shared services and whatever support that island needs.
For people who are watching this later, that's because Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica as a Category 5 this week. That I asked about that. So yep. You're really bringing up, I think, two things that are different about regulatory change stressors than other stressors. For a business leader who has a board of directors or stakeholders, investors, their goal. Their goal is that you're going to continue to be increasingly profitable. For people who work in a market that is predictable, your market may be looking for higher quality, lower cost. So changes that happen, you at least understand ahead of time the direction they're going in. And what you just said the penny hadn't really dropped for me before now, Pete, is that not only I knew because of my work in medicine that regulations across states are not uniform, but what I realized is we don't know the point, meaning there's no unified mission. I'm not saying that any individual lawmaker doesn't have a goal when they enact something. There's not only no unified decision-making, there's no unified mission. California isn't trying to make the same thing happen that Florida's trying to make happen, that Minnesota's trying to make happen, that South Dakota is trying to make happen. Everybody has a different goal. And when you don't know what someone's aiming at, their actions become even harder to predict.
Yeah,
So,
I'd say very, very much, Dr. G, and sorry to step in there, but
please.
in the context of running a technology company, how do we as an organization um, enable ourselves in prioritizing our solution roadmaps? Because we're not in the business of building a custom solution for one utility. That's not what drives profitable and sustainable growth for our shareholders as a publicly traded company. Um, and so we like to say inside our organization, challenge creates opportunity. The evolving regulations in the United States, sort of term by term and state by state, create opportunity for us, and synthesizing those changes and trying to find commonality in the absence of a clear mission is, I think, what gets a lot of us up out of bed every day to try to figure out how to solve problems.
That idea, challenge creates opportunity, but we're going to drill down to the human level, the human capital we have within our organizations.
Yep.
And hearing that from your leadership is occasionally inspiring, and sometimes I think probably feels like a heavy weight to carry, right? Feels like, yes, it builds opportunity. It also builds, heartburn, gray hair, those kind of things. So, okay, let's get to the meat of the strategies that we want to brainstorm together. Caitlin, I'm going to come back to you and ask you, although Pete, I hope you'll jump in and let's have a conversation around this fundamental idea. There are a lot of stakeholders every time there's a regulatory change. It doesn't only impact our salespeople, or it doesn't only impact the people that we serve. So I'd like to talk about maybe who are some of those stakeholders that you think of in your particular industries, but how can we help all stakeholders be more resilient in the face of regulatory change? Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really hard to always pinpoint exactly where to start. When you look at something with this magnitude of change, it's how do you break it into the smallest steps. My focus is really on internal communication. So I think about all of our internal stakeholders that come top of mind. But it's always also thinking about our clinicians and our physicians and our navigators and people who are interacting with our patients day in and day out. And so how do we make sure that from an internal standpoint, we're thinking about how do we help them show up? How do we help them kind of relay this message or care for our people, whether it's in the moment or people who are facing uncertainty of if they can enroll in healthcare for the next season? How do we get them to really have that conversation and really navigate them through the complexity that is the healthcare industry on a good day at best? And so as we're thinking about the stakeholders, when we're this conversation around markets, and it can't be a one size fits all approach, right? And so how do you create something that allows for consistency, and so nobody's having to recreate the wheel over and over again, and at the same time really allow for the flexibility and learning that each of the markets that we serve need to kind of uptake and adapt in its own unique and special way. So I think as we're looking there, that's where we're starting, and then that also folds into really the needs of the patient. Dr. Garrett Ray is somebody whom I support, and she likes to say we need to be data driven and community informed. And so I think it's really starting there with understanding the needs of the communities that we serve day in and day out as that guiding light.
I would imagine, Pete, that data driven and community informed rings for you too, because you serve a lot of people, but through individual community public utilities. So it's going to be different one from another. And I really hear this idea that we have a lot of internal groups of stakeholders. We can't just assume our whole team. Like, Pete, I know at Tantalus, you have engineers, but you also have salespeople and you support customer experience people and all these different folks. I also am interested in, when you think of outside your internal staff, who your stakeholders are. Would you talk about that a little bit?
So Tantalus predominantly supports what are referred to as public power and electric cooperative utilities across the United States. With that said, we support some of the largest utilities as well. that are household names in the Bay Area, or Southern California as an example. Um, Public power and electric cooperative utilities operate effectively as nonprofits, and with a mission and mandate to really help their respective communities. A public power utility, as an example, is a utility owned by the city of Chattanooga in Tennessee, that is geared towards ensuring that the residents of Chattanooga have affordable and reliable access to power. An electric cooperative formed, electric cooperatives formed over 100 years ago by the United States government in rural communities that were outside of metropolitan areas, where the concept was making sure everybody had fundamental access to um, electricity, which is, right, arguably one of the primary commodities we rely on every single day.
Okay, but I just want to interrupt and say you're dealing with an organization formed over 100 years ago when the words smart and grid never even went together
Right.
and meant much more analog things than they do now.
And I'd say they still, in many ways, across the grid in the United States, unfortunately, are still very analog. And as an aside, I'd say a lot of electric utilities still have an allergic reaction to technology. So if you want to talk about resilience,
Like anaphylactic
selling
reaction.
technology to someone yeah, that's exactly right, that reacts to it negatively to begin. So what am I doing? Anyway, as it relates to stakeholders, um, externally,
Yeah.
we are thinking first and foremost about the individuals that comprise our customer base, the utility itself, and their respective teams, from their management team down to the folks that are in the field, and that are stringing wires, or supporting their community, and in many circumstances, members of that community. We also think in the context of even though a public power utility may be owned by city or an electric cooperative owned by members, they still have governing bodies, whether that's a city council, a city manager, a mayor, or in the context of an electric cooperative, a board of directors that are elected among its members that are trying to make the best decision possible for their membership. So we think in the context of who our customer answers to. And then, not necessarily always the case, but it does unfold. Then you got to think more holistically where funding becomes available for some of these utilities, and that gets at the state level and the federal level, where regulatory drivers can heavily influence. Um, at the end of the day, our focus is to help the electric utility ultimately help their community. Those utilities, their number one stakeholder is their customer. That's the individuals that live and work inside those communities that rely on power every day. So I'd say it's a cascading set of stakeholders, Dr. G, and certainly provides us with a fairly broad perspective all the way down to the individual paying the bill, to the individual making sure there's power, to the individual that's governing that organization, to the individual that's influencing either in terms of finance or regulatory drivers.
And
I hope that answers your question on the external basis.
it does. And you mentioned something that's true for both of your work, which is a lot of the people you're dealing with as customers, stakeholders, meaning and the staff of those for you, like so the people who work at the utility in Chattanooga that you mentioned, they also live in that community. They're also customers of that co-op or of that utility. And Caitlin, if your health centers are anything like the health center where I work, your staff, even if they're not patients at the same health center where they work, their family are, their community are. They are looking through everything we do through the lens of patients, not only because they care so much about their work, but because their sister-in-law is going to call them and be like, what does that mean that your health center is doing? Or I had a terrible experience when I went to the dentist at your clinic. And so let's talk about how do we strengthen, we cannot change the regulatory changes. It's almost like weather, right? Like it's somewhat unpredictable. It's just going to happen. And we're going to try not to die, pick up the pieces, and then, keep doing our work. So what are some of the strategies you each use to build resilience in the face of that?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in, as we are kind of at this really beginning stages, right? So a lot of the work that we're doing feels kind of behind the scenes. And a mentor of mine had said, most things that happen in an organization are because or within a conversation. And really the ability to find the kind of decision makers and drivers and innovators and collect them into and kind of orchestrate these series of conversations where they can really share best practices, find those bright spots. So as we're really thinking about how do we rethink access to care, which is a huge, problem statement out there, or an opportunity statement out there that can feel really daunting. You can break that into like what is our data science institute sharing and saying and pulling together, and what information do they have at their fingertips? What about our consumer experience team who are talking with our patients day in and day out from many walks of life? How do we talk to a market who's really innovated in the way in which they've partnered with community members? Because we know in order to serve the whole person, it's not just how do they get care when they walk through our doors, but what about their transportation needs? What about their food insecurity? What about housing? There's so many other needs that impact their health outcomes. And so there is not going to be, again, that singular solution, but having that consistent drumbeat of where have we found success before? Where are we finding barriers? And how do we orchestrate those connection points between the people who've really experienced it to build something great?
Okay, that's really helpful. And I'm going to come back to you. But Pete, what comes up for you?
I think I'd bifurcate it a little bit. As I think internally inside Tantalus and how we try to foster resiliency across the organization, I'd say we do our best to try to anticipate by monitoring what's unfolding. And I sometimes, not easy, but sometimes using your ears more so than your mouth is important. And even in that context, using your eyes. And so we have a lot of Canadian employees in our company, so hockey references are always relevant. And as we think about building resiliency, it's Wayne Gretzky's comment of he always went to where he thought the puck was going to be, not where it was. And so we try to facilitate that, and certainly try to empower members of our team to think in that capacity. I'd say similarly as we then take some of that perspective externally, when I have a chance to sit down with our customer base, it's game theory, it's scenario planning. If this changes, then what? A good example of that we've seen, it really has had impact at the community level. Massive initiative, regardless of politics, a massive initiative around stimulus funding and investment in clean energy and the Inflation and Infrastructure Acts that came through that were intended to throw billions of dollars in many circumstances to communities that really needed to upgrade infrastructure. And with push of buttons or casting votes, that access to dollars change immediately and get called into question. And so you've got smaller communities, smaller organizations, smaller utilities that all of a sudden are trying to think through. They know what needs to happen in the form of electrification and modernization. Now, all of a sudden, what they thought they were going to be able to rely on in terms of continuity and dollars disappears. So right, game theory that out, and from that, do everything feasible. I think to try to have agility and flexibility, know where the off ramps are, because when things change, especially quickly, as we've seen in 2025, it's good to be committed and have conviction towards a direction. At the same token, if you're not simultaneously thinking, at least in the world of the utility industry, how you have an off ramp when something changes very quickly, I think that's where companies like Tantalus or even utilities can go sideways real quick.
That makes sense to me. You said, Wayne Gretzky said, try and be where the puck will be. I thought about all the military people I've heard speak who say we usually fight the last war and not the next war.
Absolutely. It's very applicable.
And that's really understandable that that's what our brains do. We're like, okay, where do I have experience in this? What did I learn? I'm going to do that. But I guess to extend the military idea, if the ground has changed or the enemy has changed, that may not Probably not. Probably won't work in this circumstance.
or not necessarily lead to the lowest risk and highest effective rate. And so utilities are risk averse. Their number one obligation is to keep the lights on. So trying to think through what may change or what outside forces may influence them to change, it's really important to run game theory and scenario planning, and from their risk assessment and from their allocation of time, resource, dollars.
Yeah. Okay. Before I start to try and pull out strategies, I've got a question from someone who's watching that I wanted to bring to you. A stakeholder we haven't really talked about, and this really rings for me, is the media. And the reason I mentioned it is I'll use a really personal example from my work. When the media started to talk about, and as well they should, the changes to Medicaid, they have, 60 or 90 seconds at best to talk about a story like that. And I can't tell you the number of people, Caitlin, who came into my office and said, well, I guess this is the last time I'm going to be able to see you because I'm on Medicaid. And some of these folks are people who definitely would not lose their Medicaid. I mean, have never lost their Medicaid, people with profound disabilities or, like congenital disabilities, things that, I mean, I'm not saying never, but I'm saying it has never, and it's not happening now, even under the worst predictions. But all they saw on the news was Medicaid cuts. And people tend to hear Medicaid cut. Like, that's it for no one ever. And so the question I got was, is there an obligation or a strategy for getting the media to talk about these changes? And this person may have meant to bring attention to the problems. And I think that's a great question. But for me, I also think to either get them to aim it a little differently or add some nuance. And Pete, I'll ask you, do any of the people that you work with at these different utilities try to even get like the local news in Chattanooga to cover it differently? Are people using their connections to media to try and build some resilience in communities about what's happening? Have either of you seen that as a strategy?
Yeah, do you want me to jump in first, Caitlin, or would you like to go?
Please, go for it.
So we see it quite often, and I'd say we see it both in a positive, constructive manner as well as a deconstructive manner. And I think that depends on sentiment of the individual and the media itself, or the agency, or the group. I'll focus on the positive. We see engagement, especially at the local level, for utilities to leverage and utilize media, and for media to engage, especially as it relates to emergencies. And so after massive storm damage as an example, not only can do the utilities partner with the media to try to make sure flow of information is consistent as possible as we think about storm restoration and solving outages and mitigating property damage and loss of life. That's where you get a great symbiosis between entity, utility, and media. And then similarly, when we think about at the community level, leveraging some of those good stories of when things go well, promoting the community, promoting improvements in resiliency and sustainability by the utility, and what that utility gives back to its community. In that way, we see a very effective relationship. Now, the inverse can be true when something goes wrong, and I'd say I've seen this certainly in my time focusing on the utility sector. Media also likes to play the role of sensationalist, and in some circumstances exaggerate, which can create fear and anxiety. I see that more at the national level. I see that more at the regional level. I see it less at the community level and the local level.
That makes sense to me, because you'd think at the local level, people feel like they have a little more accountability because their neighbors are going to be like, hey, you talked about this last night.
That's exactly right. And so I think that gets to, if you're talking to an audience that you then have to go see in the community, right, in the aisles of the supermarket, or right alongside a soccer field if a kid's playing soccer, right, the level of accountability becomes very different. The stakeholder in the audience is very different. You got to kind of own what you say, and whether it's positive or negative, whether it's appropriate or not, you got to own it. I think, we see certainly in our industry today, there is not a day that's gone by in the past several months on the rise of data centers and the impact AI is going to have on people's access to power and the capacity constraints that are coming. There is a lot of merit to that. I'd also say utilities have been planning for it, some more so than others, some ahead of the curve, some behind. Um, but it's a problem. It needs investment. It needs attention. But the way in which you can see that come across various media outlets, in my mind, at least in our industry, it varies widely based on who the audience is that they're preaching to. Is it the Wall Street Journal, or is it the local city paper and the little local news channel? Um, I'd say utilities are very effective in working collectively with their local media outlets in a constructive way.
What I like about that and what I want to draw on for other people in other industries is look for a time where your media would want to be covering you anyway, because they've high viewership, wanting to know about storm damage or wanting to know about an illness in the community, just to look at energy and healthcare. But in whatever your industry is, when there's a news story that has people's attention on your industry, that's a great time to reach out to media to say, hey, we have some useful information that you could tag onto that story, since they're usually trying to keep content flowing and have it be new. That can be a time to get their attention. Caitlin, I know that right now in your role, you focus on internal communications, but I also know that corporate communications talk to each other. What advice do you have about getting the word out to build stakeholder community resilience?
Yeah, that we do have a really great partnership with our external and media relations team, and there's been a lot of collaboration in terms of the storylines that we know are really, really critical, both for our own associates to hear day in and day out, and also to be amplified. I think what Pete talked about too, that kind of national versus local. There are some things that pique people's interests in different ways, but we do see a lot of celebration, whether it's being able to give back to our communities. We've got lots of partnerships where we are partnering with food banks to give moms, pregnant moms, really iron-rich and nutritious food, especially if they're facing food insecurity. Or we are partnering with Dispensary of Hope for pharmacies and making sure that people who are uninsured can get access to medication. So there's a lot of really amazing work that happens at a local level, and those partnerships are really strong to help create that community strength and trust kind of at that level. And then really thinking about from an advocacy and policy standpoint, when and how are we able to enter in the conversation, whether it's kind of the overcrowding of the emergency departments, and what does that really have and the effect that it has in both the strain that it puts on the hospital itself and the impact that it has on the patients. And being able to talk about ways in which we're thinking about how do we think access to care differently. And so there's a really broad range. But I do think a lot of times, as Pete talked about, like getting those stories at the local level to really showcase the momentum, I think is that great partnership in action.
I appreciate that. I have one more question that came in, Pete, that I'm going to throw to you because I know you do this. How do you talk internally when you have to think about and keep track of regulatory changes in Connecticut versus Idaho versus California because not everybody who's watching us today and will watch this conversation are working across multiple states, but they often have different, sometimes contradictory regulatory groups they have to pay attention to, from their own board of directors to their county to, health department and the Department of Food Safety and all those things. So when you have different agencies you have to pay attention to, and even sometimes those contradict each other, how do you talk about that internally and stay resilient?
Now you're making me think. So I'd say the way we try to address it, the way I try to, I'd say the way I try to convey some sense of calmness in what you've just described across our organization is to stay true to purpose. I'll give you an example. Right, there is a wave of drivers around net zero trying to reduce carbon emissions. Some states much more aggressive than others in terms of time frame for our team, particularly as we think about building innovative solutions to help achieve that. There is merit to achieving that goal. There are ways of achieving that goal. Our organization believes in driving efficiency and leveraging new innovation as an example, not only to improve the resiliency of electricity and reduce the cost of it, but also have a cascading greater impact on environmental conditions. And so if we stay true to our core, and if we stay true to the purpose of what we are trying to accomplish, while the drivers may vary, while the priorities may vary state by state, at the end of the day, every utility across the United States is focused on reliability and affordability. And so if we draw down to those two principles alone, I think we can kind of navigate the noise, if that makes sense.
It
Quiet
does.
the noise. Yeah, quiet the noise as things change. And I think that hopefully translates into our team being able to focus and as a result be very effective and very impactful and not get distracted. Because right now in 2025, it's certainly what's happened in the US. I mean, right, every day seems there is a tweet that could be impactful to the direction of our business and to the direction of the customers that we serve. And so how do we stay true to who we are and stay true to the principles we know we're trying to achieve? Because at the end of the day, long term, those are the objectives of our company and the objectives that align to our customer base.
I think that's really similar to what we're seeing as well. Of there are some kind of boulders in terms of how do we think about the right care at the right place at the right time. And so those are kind of the leading guiding principles that we have, and really leaning into the market expertise because they might have different regulatory requirements on kind of whether their state has Medicaid expansion. There's a lot of different things that happen within each of the states, but I think kind of building on what Pete observed, same thing goes here, is coming down to what are the big things that we're all cohesively trying to come together. And then from from the system perspective, where can we really get some consistency and streamlining? And then where do we really empower our markets to really think about those strategic partnerships and the things that work for their communities in the best way possible. And so again, that comes back to how do we make sure that those connection points with those leaders, whether it's, hey, I'm facing this problem, somebody might be facing a similar problem in a different market. It might not all be the same thing, but they can come to some similar approaches that even if it's not just a complete lift and shift, or really apply that. So that's, I think, at the coordination level. And then, really thinking about the leadership that they have within their own markets and the strength that those leaders have, being able to help really being that amplification with their people and the communities that they serve.
I appreciate that you've landed where we started, which is what's your purpose? That doesn't change. And in between, and before we end, I am going to come back to Pete and Caitlin and ask them each to tell me something they do to bring enjoyment back to work when they're really feeling the pressure of all of this. But before that, I want to pull out some of the strategies I heard each of you, or at least one of you, mention. You really both pointed out the advantages to building trust with your stakeholders internally and externally, so that when there are changes, you didn't put it this way, but I would say they'll give you the benefit of the doubt to say, maybe you have a solution for this. We won't just decide we have to throw everything out. We will say, we'll ask questions as stakeholders. I really liked your idea, Caitlin, of going back maybe even to those regulatory bodies and saying, okay, what are best practices for, we're going to assume that you want people to have good health. We're going to assume you want people to have power. What do you recommend? But not only going to those agencies, really finding the experts in your organizations and among your stakeholders. So Caitlin, you talked about internal staff conversations, talking to clinicians and front of office staff about their expertise, even if they don't know they're an expert. really asking them what they know. And Pete, you talked about speaking to the people at those utilities and saying to them, they're experts in their community, they're experts in their infrastructure and in their equipment and their, the resources that they have. So sitting down with them. Pete, one of the strategies you talked about was this game theory, if this, then what? And that really helps our brains, because when something big and scary happens or a really big change happens, our brains tend to think, well, we're going to die now. Basically, at the neurochemical level, the amygdala puts out all this cortisol and says, freeze, fight or flight, or freeze in the face of it. And if you've already had the conversation that says, if the AI and energy needs of your community grow by 10x in a short period of time, what will we do then? They may not remember what you all decided to do, but they will remember that there was a discussion and that there was a plan. And that helps our ventromedial prefrontal cortex, there is not a quiz, don't worry about it, kick in and say, wait, we have options. We just have to go back, refresh ourselves. What were those options? Which ones do we want to choose? And that makes a big difference. You both talked about looking for, Caitlin, you called it the bright spots. Pete, you called it the opportunities. And the thing I really noticed the most about your strategies is what you highlighted right in this last part of our conversation, Pete, where you said, we're going to know that we have a purpose, know that we have, at least within ourselves, within our company, we are aligned around our goals. And rather than feeling like we have a tiger by the tail, and these are my words, not yours, but instead of feeling like we have a tiger by the tail, reminding ourselves like, yeah, that's another tiger, but we know how to handle tigers. And maybe this tiger needs something slightly different, but we're pretty expert tiger handlers. And that analogy, what I mean to say is, whatever your industry is, you have a lot of expertise and you have people with a lot of expertise in that industry. So when changes come along, what we want to do is dig into our known, what we do know about what we're capable of, what our resources are, the innovation that we've been considering or moving forward, and seeing if we already have something we can apply to that. How can we tweak it? And you both said we can't do really bespoke, differentiated for different individuals, but you can say, here's a problem. It's pointing itself out in this community. Let's innovate, learn about it, and then see where we can make it more consistent and offer it to other communities who might need it. These are strategies that are really applicable over a wide range of industries and regulatory problems, and I really appreciate that. Before we close out, just a couple of minutes, Pete, when it gets to be too much, when you need your own resilience, what do you do?
Other than call you, on occasion, I'd say beyond having a stiff glass of very good tequila, I find a lot of comfort when things get tight here or in my office is just to go spend some time with the people we work with and that are part of the organization. It's a bit hard to quantify, but I am really fortunate to serve in a company that is surrounded by very good people. And many of us have been here for a long period of time and have developed not only great working relationships, but friendships. And so I think we've got pretty good read on when some member of the team gets stressed. And so spending time with, folks inside the organization in the middle of the day, obviously there are things we all like to do outside of office, but I'd say, spending some time with folks inside. As you know, Dr. G, from our organization, we like to brand folks. So it's, our share branded swag. I'm the chief creative officer on that. So it's always fun for me to figure out something new. And if all else fails, a glass of tequila.
Fantastic. But I really appreciate that, because we know that one non-task oriented conversation between colleagues improves their discretionary effort towards their own goals and that colleagues' goals for a month. So that's really
powerful.
Yeah. Okay, Caitlin, how about you?
Aside from the stiff drink, a very similar approach in connecting back to who we are as people. So one thing that we did as a team just last week as we're a virtual team, so the ability to go and see each other in person can vary. But we ended our discussion with one good thing. And so everybody went around the horn and said, here's one good thing. It could be personal, it could be professional. I think mine was I took my 90-pound dog out for a walk when it was not 90 degrees in Austin, which was a delight. And somebody else, their wife started their own business and got a client. So I mean, like the various things that we were able to celebrate and end on that positive note, just I think gave everybody a good little tailwind to wrap up the day.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate your time and everybody who's been with us. Next month, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about the resilience that we need in the face of family strife. This sounds like it's not a workplace issue, but if that's really what you think, then you haven't spent much time in your workplace. We are three-dimensional people, and the benefit of working with millennials and Gen Z is that they won't let us get away with pretending that we are only work professionals who live in a little box. So as Thanksgiving and the winter holidays are approaching, we're going to talk about not only our own family strife, but should people in the workplace be trying to connect with or encourage people about their own family stuff? And if we should, how would we do that? I hope that you'll join me. That will be Tuesday, November 25th, which is Tuesday before American Thanksgiving. And this will be available for watching and sharing next Tuesday. Thanks to both of you, Caitlin and Pete, for joining me today. And thanks, everybody.